Okay, so I'm going to just do a quick introduction of myself while I'm getting this to come up. I am a virtual COO, fractional COO, and okay, I'm having technical difficulties. Let me see. I got it prepared and then I had to reboot my computer, and so that's the challenge here. So let's see. There we go. So what I did is I put a number of things into the presentation with the idea that, let me put a slideshow. Okay, here we go. With into the presentation with the idea that y'all might have questions. And I wanted to make sure that I hopefully addressed all the questions. I have a deep background in operations, which is why I now do fractional COO, which is actually a kind of make versus buy, right? In the back in the day, we pretty much only thought of make versus buy in the operations side of the business. And quite frankly, I come out of manufacturing. And so make versus buy was very important to what we were doing. Over the last 20 plus years, I've been a COO, a vice president, a general manager from small to mid-sized companies. Right now, I'm doing a lot of work with small startups as well as mature companies. I really love the startup space, which is why I'm excited to be here today. I work with Startup Tucson, which is how I met Eric and a number of folks on here. And I'm also the co-founder of Suprema Works Events, which this is our space we're in Barrio Viejo. We're a new co-working space that opened up last spring during the pandemic, which was awesome. But I'm happy to report that all of our offices are currently full. So that just happened a couple weeks ago. We do have programming and things like that, and we support, we do free day passes for anybody that just wants to be able to get out of their homes, because that's where everybody is right now. So, but I want to talk about basically make versus buy. There's three key factors that I like to look at: business strategy, and then quantitative and qualitative factors. And I'm going to go through each one of these, and I'm going to try to give as many examples as I can. That's why I'm keeping track of the time, because I want to make sure that I address that. And I want to leave time for any questions that you have specifically about your own businesses. The one thing about most of the folks on this call, I would think, is that what you decide to do now compared to what you might do 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, could be quite different. And so it's okay if you have a different sourcing strategy now compared to what you might have in 3 or 4 years when you decide to bring something in-house. And I'll give you a couple examples of how that might work. So the business strategy, I'm going to do one thing real quick. I'm going to move my tools over because it's right in the middle of my way. Okay. The business strategy for in-house. Typically, there's whether or not you're going to do in-house or outsource. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of things to consider. For like in-house is a lot of times what I say is core competencies are things that you traditionally shouldn't try to outsource. Because those are the things that, if you rank them on a scale, are the things that are of most value. The second thing is critical to company performance. But what's been interesting over the last 20 years, where I think my career has been deepest, is that so many things that 20 years ago we would have never thought of outsourcing that we do now. For example, one of the greatest things is managed IT service, and even ERP systems. A lot of that stuff, nobody would have 20 years ago would have thought of outsourcing any of that, or very little of it, because it was too much of a risk and the reliability was too low. And you couldn't afford to have those things go down. And so you paid a premium for that. Now today, I think most companies that have in-house IT departments are somewhat of dinosaurs, and it has a lot more to do with not the capabilities so much of the systems, but the competencies of the folks that are in the company. I noticed that a lot of companies that have lower tech people in their businesses have to have in-house IT departments because for example, because they don't have the staff internally that can do basic things that everybody on this call can do probably with their eyes closed. So those are the things that I typically recommend for in-house, for business strategy. For outsourcing, the typical decision points from a strategy are, the number one is typically reducing costs, avoiding capital investment. Again, I come from the manufacturing world. There are machines. We had 3 machines that each cost $100,000. And in the beginning, before we had those machines, when we were actually, there was a large cutting machines. I ran an apparel company, large cutting machines. We actually had hand cutting, if you can believe that, back in the day in the 90s. And then when we went to the large cutting machines, we first could afford 1, and then we could afford 2, but we still had a line where we did slow volume hand cutting, specialty cutting on the fabric. We were using both things because we couldn't afford it. So that's one of the reasons that a lot of times people will need to outsource, because they can't afford the machining or the tooling or the space even. Gain flexibility to changing demand. We had in-house capabilities of some of our products that we produced, and then we also had, when we needed to flex, we would force it out to outside sources. Access to diverse and expert resources. Again, I'm going to use this apparel company as an example because it's super easy, because everybody can understand what it is. Most of your businesses are complicated. From my standpoint, I'm not a hugely technical person, even though I've worked in a lot of technical companies, and I don't understand science all that much, even though I have a math degree. And so the access to diverse and expert resources, in the beginning, a lot of our, we don't call it CAD, but a lot of our pattern making and what they call marker making, which is a kind of a CAD system, was all, we had to actually outsource. We had part-time people, and then we had people that we actually, companies that did that at the time. Unfortunately, during the 90s and the early 2000s, before it became popular to start sewing again, there weren't very many people that were in those professions. But in the early 90s, there were, up in the area there were. So there was actually companies that provided those services, but they eventually went away. And when they went away, we had to bring those in-house. And the other thing is sometimes you're making something by one methodology, like 3D printing is a great example. There are ways to do, we now use 3D printing. And for a while there, those machines were super expensive. And you may be manufacturing something or doing prototypes on something in some sort of molding or other ways. And then you can use the new technology to test it out by outsourcing that. And that's one of the ways that you can leverage the new technology without having to necessarily invest in it in yourself. And I'd also encourage all of you to think about it in terms of, it's not just in, I keep talking about manufacturing examples, but outsourcing can be in the entire business model. We have outsourcing now for customer service. We have outsourcing for reception, accounting, engineering, quality, shipping, logistics, in addition to manufacturing, inventory management. Everything in the entire business process can now be outsourced. And that's why I think with technology, accounting is a great example, bookkeeping is a great example of something to outsource, IT, customer service, fulfillment. A lot of those things now people can do better than you can do. At some point, you may make the decision to bring them back in-house. But in the beginning, especially when you're starting up and you're doing all your early customer discovery, using all these different resources is a great way to tap into it.
I have a question, Gina.
Yes, ma'am.
I've done some research into a lot of these firms, and my question is, how do we make sure that they're paying their folks a living wage and offering benefits and doing what should be done? Because if I'm going to outsource, I don't want to do it to someone who's not, just because I can't pay, I want to make sure that they're still getting.
Absolutely, that's brilliant. That's a great question, and I appreciate that. And hey, anybody else, if you feel free to just interrupt me, and I will stop right there and answer the question. It's actually one of the qualitative factors that I'm going to talk about, but you do have to decide what kind of social, like if you have a certain social justice platform, or you believe in the paying the living wage. A good example, I'm going to use the apparel industry again, for example, is that there was a time when Nike, Reebok were all getting hammered because they were producing all their products, and there's still a lot in the apparel industry that produce overseas. They create a lot of waste, and they also have been known for that's where sweatshops came from, right? As the term came out of the apparel industry. Unfortunately, it came from like Europe and the United States. It's not like it was, the sweatshop term didn't come from overseas. It came from here. It came from the Western world. And then as labor got more expensive, in order to do those, to know those, you're going to have a supplier management program. You're going to have to go out and you're going to have to audit them, or make sure that they produce results that show you that they're audited. That's one of the unknown or the hidden costs of outsourcing. You can't just throw things over the wall and expect that they come back. You actually have to develop an outsourcing program where you're actually a supplier development program where you're managing it. And within that supplier development program, it doesn't have to be super complicated, but one of the things that I always like to say is make sure your suppliers understand your values and your vision, and that they're well aligned with that, right, Janelle? So like if that's really an important part, and you're saying that you're gonna have to spend the extra money and the extra energy to make sure that they're a part of your organization, and that they fall in line with what you're looking for. Supplier evaluation, you can create a supplier evaluation program, but typically it's going to have to be by some kind of audit. That's what I found. Does that help? That's okay? Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. One of the things I was going to point out right now is that 30 years ago, or 20, 30 years ago, probably 30, but there wasn't a lot of people really that interested in supplier management programs. And what's so interesting now, fast forward over the last 10 years, almost every major business school and or engineering program offers a whole major on supplier management, because it's become such a part of how we are. So I am by far not an expert on it, but I wanted to at least give you an overview so you guys know where you can go look. So quantitative, the first reason that almost everybody decides that they need to outsource is cost, right? And that's where a lot of you may be at in getting your prototypes done, or you're getting your initial products done, is that you can't afford the tooling. If you have like a cabinets or certain kind, a friend of mine was a CEO of a biotech company. They were a nanospray technology company, and so basically they had to always outsource their machines. What they did, the manufacture of the machines. Now the IP part of their nozzles that they did all that part in-house, but there is no way that they were going to go at that point with their funding. That's not where their funding money needed to go to. So they found they were in an area with lots of good medical machine shops, and so medical device machine shops, and so they were able to do that. But one of the things I always want to say is, there's many costs, but in addition to the actual product for outsourcing, there's shipping, handling, tariffs, the cost that you have to have expanded inventories, especially right now. Everybody on this call last spring totally experienced a total supplier meltdown, supply chain meltdown in what happened when China closed last January, right? All of a sudden, all of our inventories for everything. Anybody else, trying to go to Target at really weird times to find what you needed? That was because the supply chain fell apart. Because of it wasn't so much that we don't have a lot of inventory anymore, because accountants and companies the CFOs and the financial people, they get credit for reducing costs on their books. One of the ways to reduce costs is to reduce your inventories. Our supply chain became so thin. One of the theories is that our supply chain became so thin across the board that even a weak disruption creates all kinds of problems in both in the wholesale and the retail sector. I can go on and on for days about that, but that's another issue. But that's how things fall apart. So one of the things, if you have an 8-week lead time, you're going to need to have more inventory somewhere in the chain to be able to take your 8 weeks, especially if you get your things in bulk, your products in bulk. In addition to the point that Janelle brought up, your admin costs are going to go up if you have to manage suppliers. It may be still the best thing for you to do, but you just still have to make sure that you account for it. So when somebody shows up and say it's this much cheaper or this much more, it's a better quality and it's cheaper, make sure you have all your costs added into that. Some of the quantitative things that to look at too is, oh, I just screwed that up again, I'm sorry. Hide the flow, there we go. Okay, speed. Speed is a huge issue. So one of the quantitative, quantitative is the things that we can measure, right? So the kinds of things we can measure is cost. The second thing is speed. So one of the ways you can find speed increases is that somebody else has better processes than you. You may have to do something manually, and they have to do something, they have an automation. I saw that a lot in different manufacturing. In the beginning, so like for example, we used to produce a product line. We had a lot of accessories. We made clothing, but we had a lot of accessories. What we would do is we would try to make the first low volume accessories ourselves, and then as the orders came in, and in the meantime, we would source everything, but then we wouldn't order, because a lot of times once you go to lower price, you have to purchase higher volume. If you purchase higher volume, there's like a make versus buy decision about, we have to buy 500, but buying 500 costs us $1 a piece. If we make them ourselves, or we buy them locally, not in China, for example, they're going to cost $10 a piece. So at some point, you know that if you can at least sell 200 or 250, that's not even the right math, 50, I think it's 50. Then you're going to be, it's going to, as soon as if you can think you can sell more than the minimum price that you can get, you can either make it or get it locally, then it makes sense for you to get the extra ones, because it's going to, you'll break even just at a certain point, is knowing what your break even. Sometimes too, you don't have the skill set to produce as fast as you need it. And so skills have become an issue. And then also, I think for the folks on this call, it's really important in terms of understanding your current and future competitive environments. If you're the early person to the market with your new product, it may be a different opportunity because you'll be in high demand. If you end up getting folks that end up either copying you, your future competitive environments might mean you might need to improve, you might need to produce faster or be in competition with other folks. The other quantitative, so there was 3 quantitatives, right? Cost, speed, and investment. So those are the first things that we talked at. Investment is where this comes in, especially, I'm sure, for those of you that are seeking funding. Cash flow, for example, the ability to make sure that you have a consistent cash flow, and is it the best use of your cash? Return on your assets and invested capital. Again, if you're in an organization where you have a lot of large machinery, Janelle, you might be somebody that might be in there, not so much the machinery, but a lot of what you do is going to be capital intensive. The capital investment that it goes, where do you have to deploy your capital in? It may make sense for certain things. It makes sense for you to go ahead. It may make sense in the sense that it might be a little more expensive, but you've reduced your risk. And none of these things work outside of each other. They all work together. So I'll give you an example at the end. And then the last couple of things are workforce management and supplier management. If you have to hire a lot of people, if you have to, then you have to have all the systems in place to support them. And again, with supplier management, to the point that I spoke about earlier, suppliers are awesome, but they also can be problematic, and they do need to be managed. And they can't be just managed like purchasing. Purchasing in its truest sense is very transactional based. And a lot of times they don't spend a lot of time looking at like supplier quality and judging that supplier quality. Okay, now we're going to talk about the qualitative factors. Expertise. This is where I think there's a lot of opportunity for folks on this call. Scale. your ability to be able to reach out to lots of different people and get them to weigh in on expertise where you wouldn't necessarily be, you may only need 10% of one person's time and 5% of this skill, especially in the beginning. At some point, you know, you're 10 times the size that you are, then it may afford you to be able to do that. Technology, and I think this is huge because technology changes so quickly. And the ability to leverage somebody else's investment in technology, and who, quite frankly, may be actually better at understanding that technology, which feeds right into capability. Capability is the whole the overarching theme of delivery, right? It's the ability to integrate, scale technology, and actually give you the things that you need. Quality. I know I'm throwing a ton of stuff at you. Qualitative quality, cost of quality, measuring it and managing it, making sure that you have agreement on what that quality is, and the fact that it has management. Even in our scenario, we had a very simple business model, but we were fairly fully integrated. You know, in 2009, when the economy tanked, we put out one catalog. It came out in the fall. We made dance costumes. We made 300,000 dance costumes a year. And we would source all our fabric. Most of it came from China. And then the catalog goes out to all the dance studios. They pick all our things. And then we have like 3 or 4 months. People have different time that they want their costumes. Well, that was right when everything tanked. And what China did at that time is that there was no rhyme or reason. They just went ahead and just started shutting down factories. Well, they shut down one of the mills that produced one of the newest and most popular products that we were doing. And so we had to scramble like crazy to go resource that particular product, because if you have ever had children or ever gone to a dance recital, there's a specific time frame when people need to have their costumes. And that, from that time on, we always made sure that we had a second and third source. Even if we didn't necessarily need to pull it right away, we always had done the legwork to get that done in advance. Also, if you during one of my stints in a consulting group, we managed the supplier quality improvement program for 8 OEMs in Wisconsin: Harley Davidson, John Deere, Mercury Marine. I can't, like a couple of smaller tractor manufacturer. And basically they got together because what they realized, if they could strengthen all of these suppliers that were supplying each other and got to sort of a consistent measure of quality, they would all be better. It was a way to help the smaller companies, but it was also a way to help the larger companies, because they became more consistently dependent on all of those companies, and if smaller companies, and if one of them failed, many of them would fail, right? Qualitative, risk and reliability. This is one that I think gets, because we're entrepreneurs, we tend to be okay with risk a lot of time, but there are challenges with this. You need to have good IP protection, as well as when you're working with some of your suppliers. Now, there are suppliers that do a lot of work with other people's intellectual property, and those are the folks that you probably typically don't have to necessarily worry, not that you don't have to worry about them, but they're going to have things in place because they want to make sure that their reputation is upheld. But if you start right now with where everybody's at, you start talking to people, you don't have agreements in place, you could be at risk from losing your intellectual property. And I'm sure that's something that the folks at UACI harp on a lot and bring in folks to help you with, because that's, for a lot of you, that's a big part of what you're doing. Reliability and predictability. The tighter your supply chains get, this is more important. And this kind of goes back, the next 3 things go back to what I talked about when Janelle asked the question, is that, you know, there's been a few times in our lives where we've had all of a sudden, you know, there's been wars that have broken out in supply chain areas. There's earthquakes, there's pandemics, all those things that you can't always predict create issues. The further away your supply chain is, the more challenging that is, especially if you're not allowed to fly there anymore. And then, you know, there's a lot of talk right now about onshoring folks, onshoring back here to North America. And that doesn't mean that just to the United States, but also to Canada and to Mexico, because it's closer, because people feel like they could still drive there. The challenge is what's happened over the last 10 or 15 years. We've lost a lot of capability here in the United, from a manufacturing standpoint, that will allow us to be able to do that. In addition, some of the source of the materials can only be found in some of these other countries. So thinking about this, if you decide to go offshore, these are some of the things. And then to what Janelle brought up, the social and environmental factors. Quite frankly, one of the reasons when I first started in the apparel industry, most of the fabric, a lot of our fabric was here in the United States. There was mills here. A lot of the reason the mills are no longer here is because there's huge environmental factors. I'd highly encourage anybody, if you buy commercially produced clothing, for example, is that you make sure you always wash it, any kind of fabric, because most all of them have some kind of finish on it that is not a great chemical. I'm just telling you right now. Again, with a friend of mine was the he was a sustainability manager for Nike, and his area was Southeast Asia, specifically in Vietnam and Thailand. And they had to work really hard. You know, they were working on the environmental side, but he ended up having to also work with all the folks with the fair labor that was going on with that, because that became such a huge issue. So understanding, aligning your values, and making sure your suppliers, good suppliers will be able to provide you all this information, because especially if they tend to be, if they are doing a lot of work for a lot of larger companies, they're being asked to do it all the time. We're getting really close. Way to mitigate some of these risks and issues: having supplier agreements, customer agreements, supplier quality management and metrics. That means you keep track of the quality, you keep track of their on-time delivery, you keep track of price changes, disruptions, anything that you have problems with, you keep track of it. And then you create some sort of ranking system. Diversification of your supplier base, making sure that you have backups. I highly recommend that if you can. Even if you start with somebody, you should keep going and making sure that you're looking for those other ones. And some of your suppliers may end up wanting to do joint ventures, and they may be good people. We acquired, I think, even in the apparel company, we ended up acquiring, I think, 2 or 3 smaller suppliers into our company, technical supplier, and then actually a person that was running a small sewing house. We ended up acquiring, even that's not a very sexy industry, but there's opportunity everywhere. And some people may have the technology that you need to come in to do that. And we're on the home stretch. Okay, so one of the things to do is, you saw all those elements in this presentation, and I'll be emailing this to Eric and Anita, is that pick the thing. You can't pick everything. Decide, go through all those factors and decide what's the ones that you think are most important to you. I'd state maybe 5, no more than 10. But really rank them and pick them and figure out what's the most important. Do your in-house model and then pick your suppliers across the right. And then what you do is rank them. So for example, I'm not going to use IP because I can't think of an example, but say speed is one of your criteria. Then say you have 2 suppliers that you're looking at and you have in-house. So decide who's the best. Is supplier 1 the best? So you give them an A. And if supplier 2's the next, give them a B. And if you're a C, then you give them a C. Give yourself a C. When you go through this whole matrix, when you're done, there's a system that I like to use that I picked up back in my old continuous improvement days. And basically, after you get your ABCs up there, you give your A's a 9, your B's a 3, and your C's a 1. And the reason that you do this is it creates more differentiation between each one of those. You add the totals up for each one. And what's interesting, many times when you do that, you'll be able to figure out what's the best option for you across the board. Now, for some of you, you're going to have multiple suppliers for the same product, right? And so you may have to do this several different times and several different iterations to get this through. All right, I'm done. I think, yeah, there we go. So feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'd love to talk to people, and it would be great to, I'm gonna end this screen share.